There was a clock running inside the head of every German fighter pilot who flew against the Americans in the winter of 1943. It did not measure minutes. It measured fuel, and not their own. It measured the enemy's. Every Luftwaffe pilot on the Western Front had learned, through a year of hard arithmetic, exactly how far an American escort fighter could fly before it had to turn for home. They knew the numbers better than the men in the cockpits did. They knew that a Thunderbolt leaving England could cover the bombers as far as the German border, and then it had to go. They knew that a Lightning could push a little deeper before its twin engines started drinking the reserve, and they knew that once those fighters banked west, the bomber stream became something else entirely. Not a fortress, a column of unarmed trucks on an open road. That was the whole German air defense strategy over the Reich. Not superior aircraft, not superior pilots, patience. Climb, orbit, wait, watch the little specks of the escort peel away toward the North Sea and then fall on 4-engine bombers that could not run and could not turn and could only fly straight and level while men in them died. It worked. God, it worked. On the 11th of January, 1944, the German pilots climbing over central Germany did exactly what they had done 100 times. They formed up above the bomber stream. They watched the American escorts. They waited for the clock to run out. And the clock did run out. The Thunderbolts turned back on schedule, right where the map said they would, right where they always did. The Germans rolled in. Then, somebody looked up and saw fighters that were still there. Not Thunderbolts. Thunderbolts were unmistakable, thick-bodied things with a barrel chest and a nose like a clenched fist. Not Lightnings either, because you could identify a Lightning from 4 miles out by the twin booms alone. These were single-engine machines with a long, clean nose, a low, straight wing, and a radiator scoop slung under the belly like something swallowed whole. They were sitting above the bombers, at altitude, deep inside Germany, at a place on the map where no American single-engine fighter had any business being, and they showed no sign whatsoever of going home. To understand what those German pilots felt in the next 90 seconds, you have to understand what the previous 18 months had been like for the men in the bombers. Because the story of the 11th of January is not really the story of an airplane. It is the story of an argument that the United States Army Air Forces had with reality, lost badly, and then spent the blood of thousands of young men correcting. The argument was this. Before the war, American air power doctrine held that the heavy bomber did not need protection. The B-17 was called the Flying Fortress for a reason, and the reason was not marketing. It carried 10 to 13 heavy machine guns. Fly enough of them in tight formation, the theory went, and the interlocking fields of fire would build a cone of defensive lead that no fighter could survive entering. The formation protected itself. Escort fighters were a nice idea, but no fighter small enough to be fast could carry enough fuel to go where the bombers went. So the bombers would go alone, in daylight, at high altitude, and they would bomb precisely and they would come home. That doctrine died over Schweinfurt. On the 17th of August, 1943, the 8th Air Force sent its bombers against ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, and the Messerschmitt works at Regensburg. 60 bombers did not come back. 2 months later, on the 14th of October, they went back to Schweinfurt. Of 291 bombers dispatched, 60 were shot down outright, and dozens more limped home, so torn up they were written off. The men called it Black Thursday, and the name stuck because nothing else fit. Think about what a 10% loss rate actually means to a 20-year-old ball turret gunner from Ohio. A cruise tour was 25 missions. If 1 bomber in 10 dies on every raid, the probability of surviving 25 raids is a number so small that men stopped calculating it out loud. Crews did the math once, quietly, on the back of a form, and then they never did it again. There were squadrons in England in the autumn of 1943 where the replacement pilots stopped bothering to learn the names of the men in the next hut. What was the point? The 8th Air Force did not admit defeat after Black Thursday. It simply stopped flying deep into Germany. For the rest of October, through November, into December, the missions stayed short. Coastal targets, France, the edge of the Ruhr, places the Thunderbolts could reach. The strategic bombing campaign, the entire concept the American Air Arm had staked its independence and its budget and its reputation on, had been halted by a few hundred German fighter pilots and a fuel gauge. That was the problem the P-51 solved. But to understand how it solved it, you have to understand why nothing else could. The obvious answer was to give the existing fighters more fuel. The Americans tried. They hung drop tanks under the P-47 Thunderbolt. First, small metal ones. Then, larger paper composite tanks built in Britain, because British aluminium was needed elsewhere. Every gallon helped, and the Thunderbolt's radius crept outward from the Dutch coast toward the German frontier. But the Thunderbolt was fighting its own design. It was an enormous aircraft built around an enormous engine and an enormous turbo supercharger. And enormous engines drank. You could bolt fuel onto it all day, and the return on each gallon diminished, because carrying that fuel cost drag and weight, which cost more fuel. Beyond a point, the airplane was flying to keep its own tanks full. The P-38 Lightning had the legs. On paper, it was the answer, and in the Pacific it was, comfortably. Over Europe, it failed for reasons nobody had anticipated in the design phase. The Allison engines were built and tested in America, and then asked to cruise for hours in the wet, brutally cold, high-altitude air over northern Europe, and they did not like it. Turbo intercoolers failed, spark plugs fouled at low cruise settings, engines swallowed valves, and in a cockpit, heated only by whatever warmth trickled off the engines, mounted out on the booms, a P-38 pilot at 25,000 feet over Hanover was so cold he could not feel the control column. There are accounts of pilots being lifted from the cockpit at Boxted and Kingscliff, unable to stand. Frostbite was a routine entry in the squadron medical log. You cannot fight a BF-109 flown by a veteran when your hands have stopped working. So the answer when it came from a place nobody in the American procurement system had been looking. In the spring of 1940, the British Purchasing Commission came to North American Aviation in Inglewood, California, wanting them to build the Curtiss P-40 under license. North American's president, Dutch Kindleberger, said no. He offered instead to design them a better fighter from scratch. The British, who were watching France fall and needed anything with guns on it, agreed on one condition: speed. They wanted the prototype fast. North American's team, with Edgar Schmood leading the design work, delivered a completed airframe in roughly 120 days. The NA-73X rolled out of the shop in September of 1940, sitting on wheels borrowed from an AT-6 trainer, because the proper ones had not arrived, waiting for an engine that was late. It flew that October. Everything about it was slightly ahead of its time. The wing used a new laminar flow airfoil section developed in cooperation with NACA, with its point of maximum thickness pushed further back than conventional wings, keeping the airflow attached and smooth over more of the surface. Less drag. The wingskins were built to a tolerance that let them stay smooth in the first place, which mattered more than the theory did. And under the belly sat that scoop, which was not just a radiator housing. Its duct was shaped so that air entering it was compressed and heated by the radiator, and then expelled through a nozzle at the rear, producing a small amount of thrust that offset a good portion of the drag the cooling system created. The engineers called it the Meredith effect. Pilots just noticed the airplane went faster than it looked like it should, and it was clean in a way the others were not. A Thunderbolt looks like it was built to absorb punishment, because it was. A Mustang looks like it was drawn with a straight edge. There was one thing badly wrong with it: the engine. The Allison V1710 in the first Mustangs had a single-stage supercharger optimized for low altitude. Down low, under 15,000 feet, the airplane was superb, faster than a Spitfire on the deck. Take it up to 25,000 feet, where the bombers flew and the war over Germany would be decided, and the power fell away, and it became ordinary. The RAF received them, admired the airframe, shrugged, and assigned them to Army Cooperation Command, doing low-level tactical reconnaissance. The finest fighter airframe of the war spent 1942 photographing railway junctions in occupied France. The fix came from a test pilot named Ronald Harker, who worked for Rolls-Royce. In April of 1942, he flew a Mustang at Duxford for about half an hour, landed, and wrote a report saying, in essence, that this airplane was being wasted and that somebody should put a Merlin 61 in it. The Merlin 61 had a two-stage, two-speed supercharger. It kept making power where the Allison quit. Rolls-Royce converted a handful of airframes to test the idea. The results were not incremental. They were absurd. The same airplane that had been mediocre at altitude was now, at altitude, faster than anything either side had flying. In the United States, Packard was already building Merlins under license, and the American conversion became the P-51B and P-51C. Top speed a shade over 440 miles an hour, up near 30,000 feet. But speed was almost the smallest part of it, and this is the point most people miss. What made the Mustang decisive was not that it was fast. It was that it was fast while carrying a fuel load nobody else could match. Because the airframe was so aerodynamically efficient, and because the internal tankage was generous for its size, and because two drop tanks could be hung under the wings without ruining it, the P-51 could fly a long way, arrive, fight, and fly home. That was the trick nobody had managed, not range alone. Range plus the ability to win when you got there. Escort radius for a Thunderbolt in early 1944 with tanks was somewhere around 400 miles. For a Mustang with 275-gallon tanks, it was well past 600. And later, once an 85-gallon fuselage tank was fitted behind the pilot, past 800. There was no target in Germany outside that circle. None. Not Berlin, not Leipzig, not anywhere. The airplane existed. The problem was that in January of 1944, there was exactly one group in England flying it, and almost nobody had noticed. That group was the 354th Fighter Group, based at Boxted in Essex. And by the standards of the 8th Air Force, it was nobody. It did not even belong to the 8th. It was a 9th Air Force unit, meant for tactical work supporting the invasion that everyone knew was coming. Loaned to 8 Fighter Command because 8 Fighter Command needed anything it could get. Its pilots had arrived in England in November of 1943, having trained on P-39 Airacobras. Most of them had never flown a Mustang. Several had never seen one. They got them, learned them in a few weeks of English winter weather, and flew their first sweep over Belgium on the 1st of December. 2 weeks later, on the 13th, they escorted bombers to Kiel, which at that moment was the longest-ranged escort mission in the history of the 8th Air Force. And it was flown by a group of new pilots in an aircraft type nobody in Europe had much confidence in yet. 3 days after that, over Bremen, a lieutenant named Charles Gumm shot down a Bf-109, and the Mustang had its first kill in Europe. Small numbers, small headlines. Nobody in Berlin was alarmed. German intelligence had the aircraft identified, had its performance figures roughly right, and did not think it changed anything. Because a few dozen fighters cannot alter a strategic situation, which is true right up until the day it isn't. 2 other things changed in the first week of January, and neither of them was technological. On the 6th of January, Major General James Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force. Doolittle was a racing pilot before he was a general, a man with a doctorate in aeronautics, who had led 16 bombers off a carrier deck toward Tokyo in 1942, when everybody involved understood that the odds of coming back were poor. He was not a man with a sentimental attachment to doctrine. Shortly after taking over, Doolittle visited the headquarters of 8th Fighter Command and its commander, Major General William Kepner. On the wall was a sign that expressed the governing philosophy of American fighter operations in Europe. It said, in substance, that the first duty of 8th Air Force fighters was to bring the bombers back alive. Doolittle looked at it and told Kepner to take it down. The replacement said that the first duty of 8th Air Force fighters was to destroy German fighters. That sounds like a slogan. It was a revolution. Under the old rule, escort pilots were chained to the bomber stream. They flew slow, weaved to stay in position, burned fuel doing it, and were forbidden to chase. A German fighter could make a firing pass, dive away, climb back up at leisure, and come again, because the Americans were not allowed to follow. The Germans set the tempo of every engagement and always had the option to leave. Doolittle cut the chain. Fighters could now range ahead of the bombers, hunt, pursue, and go down after the enemy on the deck, and shoot up his airfields on the way home. The bombers were no longer the thing to be protected. The bombers were the bait. Kepner, who had been arguing for exactly this for months, is said to have asked if Doolittle really meant it. He meant it. 5 days later, they flew Mission 182. The plan for the 11th of January was ambitious to the point of provocation. 663 heavy bombers, dispatched against the German fighter industry itself. The AGO works at Oschersleben, which was building Focke-Wulf 190s. The Junkers plants at Halberstadt. The aircraft works at Brunswick. Not rail yards, not docks, not oil, the factories that made the fighters that were killing them. It was the 8th Air Force, going back into central Germany, for the first serious time since Black Thursday, 3 months earlier. And everyone from the division commanders down understood exactly what that meant. The escort was 13 groups of fighters, 11 of Thunderbolts, 1 of Lightnings, and 1 of Mustangs. 49 P-51s went out that morning from Bachstadt with orders to cover the deepest penetration, because they were the only ones who could. Then the weather turned. It had been marginal at takeoff, and it deteriorated fast. Cloud built over England behind them, which meant that even if the bombers reached the target and bombed and turned for home, the fields they were meant to land on might be closed. Somewhere over the North Sea and the Dutch coast, 8 Bomber Command issued the recall. Bring them back. Most of the force turned. The 2nd and 3rd divisions swung west. But recall orders take time to reach 300 aircraft in radio silence and thick air. And the leading formations of the 1st Division were already deep in, closing on Oschersleben. And the officer leading them, Brigadier General Robert Travis, made a decision. They were nearly there. Turning now meant taking all the risk of the approach and getting nothing for it. He pressed on. A wing of the 3rd Division bound for Brunswick did the same. So, roughly a third of the force continued into central Germany, with most of the escort turning back with the recalled bombers. The Luftwaffe controllers watched the plot on the boards at their operations rooms and could hardly believe what they were seeing. This was the situation German air defense had been designed and refined and prayed for over 2 years. A deep penetration by an unsupported bomber force, spread thin, strung out, past the point where anything could reach them. They scrambled everything. Fighters from JG-1 and JG-11 out of the northern fields. JG-3 and JG-26 units. Night fighter crews put up in daylight. And the Zerstörer units, the twin-engine Bf-110S and Me-410S, heavy destroyers loaded with cannon and underwing rocket tubes. Aircraft that were far too slow and clumsy to survive against a single-engine fighter, but perfectly suited to standing off beyond the range of a bomber's machine guns and lobbing 21-centimeter mortar rounds into a formation until it came apart. Something on the order of 200 German fighters converged. The tactics by that stage of the war were well-developed and brutally effective. Head-on attacks coming in from 12 o'clock high because the B-17 seconds frontal armament was its weakest, and because a closing speed of 550 miles an hour gave the bomber gunners no time at all. You flew straight at a formation of 4-engined aircraft, held your fire until you were close enough to see the rivets, put a burst into the cockpit or the inboard engines, and then flicked through the formation and away. It took nerve of a kind that is hard to describe. It also worked. Break up the box, knock one bomber out of position, and the wounded aircraft falls behind, and then the whole pack turns on it. Over Oschersleben and Halberstadt and Brunswick, that afternoon, the German fighters got everything they wanted and did what they had trained to do, and American bombers began falling out of the sky in numbers not seen since October. And then, into that, came the 354th. 49 Mustangs against something like 200 defending fighters, spread over a running battle 150 miles long. The odds were not merely bad. They were arithmetic that should not have produced a result. The group squadrons got separated almost immediately, which is what always happened, because a fighter fight at 25,000 feet dissolves into individual duels within about 40 seconds of the first shot. Pilots lost their wingmen. Elements broke up. Men found themselves alone over Germany with the fuel gauge falling and enemy aircraft everywhere. One of them was a major named James Howard. Howard was 30 years old, which made him ancient in that company. He had been born in Canton, China, to American parents, had gone to Pomona College, had flown for the Navy, and had then resigned to join Claire Chennault's American Volunteer Group. He had fought the Japanese, over China and Burma with the Flying Tigers and had scored there, and when the AVG disbanded, he came home, took a commission in the Army Air Forces, and ended up in England leading the 356th Fighter Squadron. His Mustang carried the words Ding Hao on the nose, Chinese for very good, along with a row of Japanese flags and a row of German crosses on the same aircraft, which almost nobody in the war could claim. Late that morning, he found himself alone above the 401st Bomb Group. The 401st was in serious trouble. It was near the front of the surviving formation, it was over hostile territory with the target ahead, and a large number of German fighters were setting up to work it over methodically. Howard could see the boxes below him and could see the enemy aircraft positioning, and he could see that no other American fighter was anywhere in the sky. He went in alone. What followed lasted better than half an hour and was witnessed by several hundred men who had absolutely nothing else to do but watch it. Howard attacked a twin-engine fighter first and shot it down. Then he went after the single-engine fighters queuing up on the bombers, and every time a formation of Germans began to set up an attack run, he flew into the middle of it and broke it up. He was one aircraft. They were dozens. He had no wingman, no cover, and no way to be in two places at once. So he used the only advantage the Mustang gave him, which was that he could go anywhere in that block of sky faster than they could, and could arrive, fire, disengage upward, and be somewhere else before anyone could get behind him. His guns began to fail. The P-51B carried only 450 caliber machine guns, and they were mounted, canted over in the thin wing, which meant the ammunition belts had to feed at an angle. Under high G loading, they jammed. It was the airplane's one genuine, well-documented defect, and every pilot who flew the B model knew about it and dreaded it. One of Howard's guns quit. Then another, then a third. He kept attacking with one gun. He kept attacking with one gun after he had reason to believe he was out of ammunition entirely, making dry-firing passes at German fighters purely to make them break off, because a Focke-Wulf pilot cannot know your guns are empty and will not sit still while a Mustang closes from behind on the chance that they are. The bomber crews of the 400 first watched the whole thing, from the waist windows and the tail positions and the top turrets. They watched a single American fighter refuse to leave, in a sky where, by every established rule of the previous 2 years, the American fighters had always left. There is a phrase that turns up in almost every bomber crew memoir from that winter, and it is worth understanding properly. The crews called the escort fighters little friends. It sounds sentimental now. It was not. It was the most precise language available to men who spent 6 hours a day sitting inside a thin aluminium tube full of high-octane fuel and oxygen bottles, unable to maneuver, unable to run, watching specks in the distance and trying to work out whose they were. A bomber crew could not defend itself in any meaningful sense against a determined fighter attack. It could only make the attack expensive. The escort was the only thing standing between them and simple arithmetic, and when the escort left, which it always did, the whole formation felt it go. Men described the moment the Thunderbolts waggled their wings and turned west as the loneliest thing they experienced in the war. And several of them said it was worse than the flak, because flak was impersonal and fighters were not. So when the crews of the 400 first looked out that day and saw an American fighter that stayed and kept staying and was still there 20 minutes later when by every precedent it should have been halfway to the channel, they were not simply watching an act of individual courage. They were watching the arithmetic change in front of them. Howard eventually ran his fuel down to the point where he had to go, and he went. When he landed, he made a laconic report and did not think much of it. What made the difference was the bombers. The crews of the 400 first came back to their base and started talking, and their statements went up through their own chain of command, and the group commander pushed it, and the war correspondents got hold of the story of one man and 30 enemy aircraft, and it went around the world. He was credited with 3 destroyed on that mission, with more probable. The number was never really the point, and Howard himself said as much for the rest of his life. In June of 1944, on the field at Boxted, General Karl Spaatz pinned the Medal of Honor on him. He remains the only fighter pilot in the European theater to receive it. The Mustang Group as a whole claimed around 15 enemy aircraft that day for the loss of one of its own. The bomber force paid a different price entirely. 60 heavy bombers did not come back from Mission 182. 60 aircraft, with 10 men in most of them. Do the arithmetic, and you get roughly 600 young men who took off from England that morning and did not land there that evening. Some were dead in the wreckage in a Saxon field. Some had gone into the freezing water. Some were walking across Germany with a bad ankle and a phrase book and would be in a camp within a week and there for the next 16 months. And for every one of them, a form was filled out. That is what actually happened next. In the hours after the fighting stopped, in the operations huts at Molesworth and Bassingbourn and Deenathorpe, clerks sat with typewriters and made out missing air crew reports. Serial number of the aircraft, names, ranks, and service numbers of every man aboard, position in the formation, last observed, number of parachutes seen, if any, and by whom. Somebody in the surviving bombers had counted chutes coming out of a burning fortress at 24,000 feet while being shot at, and that count went onto a piece of paper, and that piece of paper went into a filing system, and it is still in that filing system now. Every one of those men left a paper trail, a missing aircrew report, a telegram, a serial number stamped into a dog tag that still sits in a file. If your family has a name, a photograph, and a box of objects nobody ever explained, that trail is still there and it can still be followed. I wrote a guide to doing it. Find Your Grandfather's War is linked in the description. It takes you record by record until the man in the picture has his war back. Because that is the strange thing about the 11th of January. On the American side, it looked, at first, like a defeat. 60 bombers, 600 men, newspaper headlines that were careful with their adjectives. The mission was flown into a recall into weather with a third of the force and a fraction of the escort, and it cost as much as Black Thursday had. But on the German side, the men who had been flying up there knew something the newspapers did not. They had not been able to get away. That was the part that would not leave them alone that night. Not the losses, although those were real. What lodged itself in the mind of every experienced German pilot who fought over Oschersleben was the discovery that the escape had stopped working. For 2 years, the standard German technique for breaking off a fight with American fighters had been to roll onto your back and dive. It worked because it exploited real physics. The F-109 and the F-190 could enter a dive quickly, and a Thunderbolt, heavy as it was, would follow and eventually catch up, but by then you were down low, near the deck, near home, and the Thunderbolt had to leave anyway. Diving away was not cowardice. It was doctrine. It was how a German fighter pilot survived long enough to become useful. Against a Mustang, it did not work. The P-51 followed you down. It had the speed to stay with you in the dive and the clean airframe to keep gaining. And when you leveled out and looked for the horizon, expecting the American to be a receding dot heading west because his fuel was gone, he was still behind you. Because his fuel was not gone. He had crossed the North Sea and crossed Holland and crossed half of Germany, and he still had enough in his tanks to chase you all the way home and shoot at you while you tried to land. Read enough German accounts of early 1944, and this is what recurs. Not the speed, not the guns, not any single performance figure, the refusal to leave. Heinz Nock of JG-11, who kept a diary through the whole war and flew against the Americans through this exact period, records the shift in the tone of it. The missions become something to be survived rather than something to be flown. Johannes Steinhoff, who ended the war flying jets and with his face burned half away, said afterwards that what the Mustang really did was force the Luftwaffe to fight over Germany every single day with no relief. That was the mechanism. Not that the airplane was invincible. It wasn't. A good pilot in a 109G could fight a Mustang and win, and many did. But there was no longer any such thing as a safe day, and no such thing as a safe altitude, and no such thing as a safe field to land on. The consequences arrived within weeks. In late February came the series of raids the Americans called Big Week. 6 days of maximum effort against the German aircraft industry, flown with Mustang escort all the way. On the 4th and 6th of March, the 8th Air Force went to Berlin. The 6th of March cost 69 bombers, the worst single day the 8th ever had. And it did not matter, because they came back on the 8th and again after that, and the escorts came with them every time. Adolf Galland, who commanded the German fighter arm and who was one of the most clear-eyed men in the Luftwaffe about what was happening, put it in a sentence that has outlived almost everything else he said. When he saw Mustangs over Berlin, he knew the game was finished. The attrition figures underneath that are the real story, and they are worse than the aerial victory claims suggest. Both sides overclaimed enormously, the Americans by a factor of several on some days, and the honest German loss figure for the 11th of January is far lower than the 200-odd the 8th claimed. That is normal. Fighter pilots in a swirling fight genuinely cannot tell whether the aircraft they hit went down or went home. What could not be fudged was the pilot roster. German aircraft production actually rose through 1944. Albert Speer's dispersal program worked better than the Allies expected, and the factories kept turning out fighters in numbers that would have been unimaginable in 1942. Airframes were never the constraint, men were. Through the first 5 months of 1944, the Luftwaffe's day fighter force lost something on the order of its entire pilot strength, several times over, in a rolling hemorrhage that the training schools could not backfill. The experienced men, the ones who had been flying since France and Russia and the Battle of Britain, and who knew how to fight a Mustang, were killed steadily, and each one took his knowledge with him. The replacements arriving to take their places had roughly 160 hours of flying time. Some had less. An American replacement pilot arriving in England in the same month had 300 hours, and often well over that, plus a period of theater training before he flew a combat mission. That gap is the whole story of the air war in 1944 in a single figure. It was not really a contest of aircraft. 160 hours against 350 is not a duel. It is a boy with almost no experience being sent up to intercept a professional in an aircraft that is faster than his, and the outcome of that meeting is decided before either of them opens fire. Then, in May, the 8th turned its bombers onto the synthetic oil plants, and the last thing holding the German fighter force together came apart. There were airframes. There were even, in a rough sense, pilots. There was no aviation fuel. Training hours were cut further because there was no petrol to burn on training, which produced worse pilots who were shot down faster, which required more replacements, who received even less training. The loop closed and it fed on itself for the rest of the war. Germany's technical answer was the Me-262, and it was a genuinely superb aircraft, a generation ahead of anything the Allies had flying in numbers. It was also produced too late and in too few numbers to matter, and crucially, the Americans worked out very quickly that jets are vulnerable on approach. So Mustangs simply loitered near the jet fields and shot them down while they were slow, low, and committed to landing. The finest fighter in the sky is worthless if it cannot come home. None of this was free for the men flying the Mustangs. The airplane's reputation now is so gilded that it is easy to forget that it killed a lot of the young men who flew it. The early B models had those jamming guns. The fuselage tank behind the pilot, when full, shifted the center of gravity so far aft that the aircraft was genuinely dangerous to maneuver until you had burned an hour off it, and pilots were warned to fly straight and gentle until they did. It was liquid-cooled, which meant a single rifle-caliber round in the radiator or a coolant line, and you had perhaps 5 minutes of engine before it seized. A fragility that Thunderbolt pilots never let Mustang pilots forget. Missions ran 7 and 8 hours in a cockpit you could not stand up in, at altitudes where the temperature outside was 50 below, breathing bottled oxygen with nothing to do for hours but hold formation and think. Charles Gumm, the lieutenant who scored the first Mustang victory over Bremen in December, was dead by the 1st of March. His engine failed on takeoff from Boxted, and he had a choice between putting the aircraft into a village or not, and the accounts say he steered away from the houses. He was 23. The 354th Fighter Group ended the war as the highest-scoring fighter group in the entire European theater. They earned the nickname the Pioneer Mustang Group, and they earned it in the 6 weeks between the 1st of December, 1943, and the middle of January 1944, when they were the only unit in Britain proving that the thing could be done at all. So go back to the 11th of January and stand in the German cockpit for a moment, because that is where this story actually lives. You are somewhere over Saxony at 24,000 feet. Below and ahead of you is a formation of American bombers that has come further into Germany than it has any right to have come. On a day when the weather is closing and the escort has turned back and everything is set up exactly the way you have been taught it should be. This is the good day. This is the one you fly 100 bad ones to get. You roll in, and there is a fighter you do not recognize coming down out of the sun at you. And it is single-engined, and it is faster than you are, and you break away hard the way you have broken away 100 times, and you dive, because diving has always worked. And when you flatten out and look in the mirror, he is still there. That is the moment. Not a headline, not a statistic, not a line on a production chart. One man in one cockpit understanding in the space of about 4 seconds that the rule he has built his survival on has just been repealed. The war did not end that day. The Luftwaffe fought for 16 more months and killed a great many more American aircrew doing it. There were terrible days ahead for the 8th Air Force, days worse than the 11th of January. Berlin, in March. The Jets, in the winter of 1944. Men died over Germany in April of 1945, when the outcome had not been in doubt for a year. But the argument was settled on the 11th of January, 1944, over Oschersleben. Not because the Americans had built a wonder weapon. The P-51 was not a wonder weapon. It was a conventional, single-engine, single-seat, propeller-driven fighter with 4 machine guns. Built around an engine the British had designed for a different aircraft, in an airframe originally rejected as unsuitable for high-altitude work. There was nothing in it that any competent aeronautical engineer of 1940 could not have understood. It won because of something duller and more absolute than genius. It could go where the bombers went, and it could still fight when it got there, and it could still fight on the way back. That was all. That one thing removed the German fighter arm's ability to choose its battles. And once you cannot choose your battles, you are no longer fighting a campaign. You are simply being consumed. 60 bombers went down on the 11th of January, 600 men. And somewhere, over central Germany that same afternoon, a fair number of German pilots landed, climbed down, and stood on the grass for a while without saying anything. Because they had just learned the thing they were going to have to keep to themselves. The Americans could reach anywhere now, and there was nowhere left to hide.